Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. I'm continuing my series on the allegation that Matthew made composite discourses in a dyschronological way. Dyschronology, again, being making it look like in your document something happened at a time when it didn't happen, when you know it didn't happen, but in the story world of your document, you're trying to make it look like it happened at that time. That is a pretty frequent scholarly idea about Matthew, that he did this. He made composite discourses, and he was doing so in a way that was dyschronological, gathering things up from elsewhere where he knew they weren't said, and then making it look like Jesus said them all on a given occasion, when he knew that Jesus didn't say at least all of them on that occasion. And I'm rejecting that. I'm making use of the work of D.A. Carson, who also rejects it. I want to summarize, because this is really detailed stuff. I want to summarize today some of the where we've been points, and then go into the topic for today. So where we've been. Is there good evidence of dyschronological composite discourses in Matthew? All right. When there are teachings found in the Sermon on the Mount or some other discourse in Matthew, and then found, quote unquote, elsewhere in Luke, these are often achronological in Luke. That's a point that I've made. Achronological meaning not trying to put a really specific time on them. So there's not even an apparent conflict at that point between Luke and Matthew, when you can tell that it's achronological in Luke. Luke just apparently didn't know when it was said, so Matthew might have known that it was said on the occasion of, say, the Sermon on the Mount. All right. Second point, the Sermon on the Level Place, which is found in Luke 6, and the Sermon on the Mount, I would say, and argued last time, were probably the same event. That means that the overlapping sayings between those two sermons, though with somewhat different wording, are actually being placed in the same event. So therefore that doesn't argue that Matthew was grabbing them from a different context and making it look like Jesus said them in a discourse. Also, there is no contradiction between the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Level Place about location, nor is this just desperate. Luke himself indicates that Jesus was in the hills just prior and came down and stood on a level place to give the sermon. This is compatible with Jesus speaking on a mountain or in a mountainous region, and Matthew's language is compatible with the acoustic advantage of having the audience above him. Matthew doesn't say that he was standing on the tippy top and looking down at the audience. Okay, they're just emphasizing it in different ways. His standing on a level place within a hilly region, and his being up in a hilly region. All right. Then in the rare places where Luke has a saying found in the Sermon on the Level Place that isn't found anywhere in Matthew, this merely indicates partial independence between Matthew and Luke. That even if they are, to some extent, using the same source, that doesn't mean they are restricted only to that same source. Luke apparently had a source of information not known or not remembered or not recorded by Matthew. We have other evidence of that, even in other overlapping incidents in Matthew and Luke, so that shouldn't be surprising. So sometimes Luke knew of a saying on that occasion, that Sermon on the Level Place, also, which was also the Sermon on the Mount, that Matthew just doesn't record. That's entirely plausible. All right. And that also, by the way, accounts for some differences in wording, like blessed are the poor versus blessed are the poor in spirit, that partial independence. All right. Today, I want to start thinking about the additional and very important plausible possibility, indeed probability, that Jesus taught the same saying on more than one occasion. Now, this of course is mocked by critical scholars. If you say Jesus taught it twice, oh, it's so desperate, so fundamentalist, so silly, etc. But that's not at all a strange idea. Indeed, teachers themselves know better than to mock at that idea. Teachers know that they teach the same thing more than once, even in very, very similar wording. Teachers, pastors, speakers, whatever, you teach the same thing more than once. Just not surprising at all. So I want to quote again Carson here. Any experienced itinerant preacher will confirm the inescapability of these tendencies. More important, if one distances oneself from the more radical presuppositions of form and tradition criticism, the New Testament documents themselves confirm this approach. And then he gives a whole list of references and says you should compare them. And that type of comparison is what I'm going to be talking about in the rest of the video today. The only slight tweak I would give to that quote from Carson is that unfortunately the tendency to mock any idea that Jesus did the same thing twice or more than twice or taught the same thing more than once is not restricted to what we might call radical tendencies or radical presuppositions. It's endemic endemic throughout the critical scholarly world. It's especially in redaction criticism. So I'd like to say, oh well, distance yourself from the radical presuppositions, and you'll be over here saying this reasonable thing. But that mocking at additive harmonization is just not considered radical, unfortunately. But other than that, I love what Carson has to say there, the inescapability of these tendencies. Now, what I'm going to talk about today for the rest of this time is places where we find 2 times, or even more than 2 times, that Jesus says the same kind of thing within a single gospel. He's recorded sometimes as saying, sometimes almost verbatim, something very similar in 2 different settings within a single gospel. Why is this important? Well, remember that the whole shebang, if I can put it this way, of the argument that Matthew made, dyschronological composite discourses, is finding parallel sayings in other synoptic gospels that are at least not explicitly said to be in a discourse at the same point in Jesus' ministry, and sometimes do appear to be in another setting. That's it. That's the whole thing. When somebody's arguing for composite discourses, they'll just go and they'll just make this list of parallels, whether it's the Sermon on the Mount or what's sometimes called the commissioning discourse in Matthew 10, where Jesus is speaking to his disciples before he sends them out on a mission. In Craig Evans's commentary on Matthew, he does this for the commissioning discourse. It's just like, voila, here are these parallels. So then you can see that Matthew must be moving stuff, okay? So the trick of that is to parallel a reference in Matthew in one of his discourses that he records Jesus saying to a reference in some other synoptic gospel, that is Mark or Luke, that sounds very similar, but that's not at that time, okay? Because then the idea is Matthew knew that Jesus didn't say it at that time, either through his access to Q, the hypothetical common source between him and Luke, or through his access to Mark, and he kind of picked it up, like we do cut and paste in a word processing document. He snipped it and moved it to create a composite discourse. Indeed, in Evans's wording about the commissioning discourse, it really looks like he doesn't even think that we have any reason to think there was a discourse at this time at all. In the case of the Sermon on the Mount, he appears to think that, the part that's also found in Luke may have been said at one time, but then the rest gathered dyschronologically by Matthew. So that's how the argument goes. So if we find a place where Jesus is saying the same thing on more than one occasion in a single gospel that really pushes back against that. And the reason it really pushes back against that is because it looks like the author of that gospel is telling his audience that Jesus did say something very much like this on more than one occasion. Okay, so Jesus was fond of that teaching, and he said it on more than one occasion. Even in Matthew, sometimes we find the same thing in more than one place. So that's evidence that's independent of this argument about discourses in Matthew and composite discourses, that Jesus taught that saying more than once. It doesn't look like it's moved. So even in Matthew himself, if Matthew records something in a discourse, and then like in the Sermon on the Mount or the commissioning discourse, and then also records something very similar in another setting in Jesus' life, this is evidence that Matthew's not doing what they're saying. He's not running off and doing snip, cut and paste, and moving, gathering that saying from another place and plunking it down, using it to pad out or create a composite discourse. Instead, it looks like Matthew himself thinks and is representing that Jesus taught that thing more than once in a discourse and once on that another occasion. So he's not doing this moving thing. There's no reason to think he's doing this moving thing. Now, this is especially true where Matthew has it twice in his own gospel, and one of those times is the exact parallel to the other occasion that we find in, say, Mark. Okay, and I have seen scholars do this. It's very illicit. And Evans does it concerning a saying, a teaching found in the commissioning discourse, to cite a saying in Mark, okay, that's not in a discourse or not on that occasion, and parallel it to a Matthean instance of that saying that is in a discourse and kind of do the voila thing. See, Matthew moved it, when Matthew himself also has the real obvious parallel within his own gospel to that non-discourse setting in the gospel of Mark or Luke. You see what I'm saying here? So let me just repeat it a little bit. If Matthew has the exact scene that we find in the other synoptic gospel and Jesus teaching a given teaching in that exact scene, and then he also has it in a discourse, it's illicit to quote or cite the saying in the other gospel and line it up in parallel to the discourse setting in Matthew, because it's the wrong parallel in Matthew. I'm going to illustrate what I'm talking about here in a couple of instances. All right, divorce. This is a case where this is done. I can't recall if Evans does it. I believe the scholar Stein does it. But anyway, you'll find it in any list of Sermon on the Mount parallels. Okay. Like a critical scholarly redaction critical list. All right. In the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:31-32, Jesus teaches on divorce. Very famous teaching that you can't divorce and remarry unless a man can't divorce his wife and remarry, even if he gives her a certificate of divorce, except for fornication. Matthew has that except for fornication exception clause in there. All right. Now, we find Jesus teaching something similar, though not with identical wording, in Mark 10. And it's pretty firmly placed in Mark, much later in Jesus' ministry than when Matthew places the Sermon on the Mount, and not in a discourse setting. Jesus is being challenged by the religious leaders about divorce and replies. And his reply is very similar to what's in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. Okay, is this evidence that Matthew went to using Mark and grabbed this teaching on divorce and snipped it out and picked it up and dropped it over dyschronologically into the Sermon on the Mount? No. And here's one way we can tell: no. Because Matthew shows Jesus teaching the same thing on divorce twice within Matthew's own gospel. The real parallel passage to the setting in Mark 10 is Jesus teaching about divorce in Matthew 19:3 and following. There can be little doubt that those two passages do describe the same incident. Okay, so Matthew not only knows about the teaching later in the ministry when Jesus is challenged by the teachers, he tells about it right in his own gospel. Okay, so it's completely incorrect to parallel the Mark 10 teaching with the Sermon on the Mount. That's the wrong parallel. Since Matthew himself has the actual incident found in Mark 10 later in his own gospel, Matthew is not collecting this teaching from a different setting and dyschronologically moving it to the Sermon on the Mount. Instead, Matthew is portraying, and why should we not think that he actually sincerely believed, that Jesus taught the same thing on the same topic more than once. Okay, you see how this goes, you see how this works. But when you just read this list of impressive sounding parallels as an argument for Matthean composite discourses, you often won't be told that. And the wrong passage in Matthew will be sometimes paralleled to a passage in one of the other synoptics. Okay, here's another one. That you should deny yourself and take up your cross and follow Jesus. All right, Matthew 10:38-39 has this teaching in the commissioning discourse where Jesus is talking to his disciples before sending them out. He who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who has found his life will lose it, and who has lost his life for my sake will find it. All right, now in Mark 8:34-38, and so even though this is a lower chapter number in Mark is just shorter than Matthew. So even though it's Mark 8 and it is in fact a later time than Matthew 10 because Mark is just a shorter gospel. All right. This is when Jesus is teaching his disciples that he must die, and Peter says, no, you're not going to die, and Jesus rebukes him and says, get thee behind me, Satan. It's clearly a different setting from the commissioning discourse setting in Matthew. He summoned the crowd with his disciples and said to them, this is Mark 8:34, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For let me get the right page here. Whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? What will a man give in exchange for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. Okay, so this thing about taking up your cross and denying yourself and following Jesus, okay, and saving, if you try to save your life, you'll lose it, etc., is in both places. But the setting I've just read in Mark is definitely later than the Sermon on the Mount setting. I would not say that that is achronological. Ooh, okay, so does this mean that Matthew collected this saying about denying yourself and taking up your cross from a different setting in Mark that he knew was different and moved it to kind of fill out a composite commissioning discourse? No. And here's one way we can know. Matthew 16:24-27 is the real parallel. It's the exact same setting as in Mark. He knows about that. Not only does he know about it, he records it. And he records it in the same setting as Mark. All right, of saying he's going to die, rebuking Peter. Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, etc. The Son of Man is coming in the glory of his Father with his angels and will then repay every man according to his deeds. Very similar wording, is clearly the same thing as in Mark. Okay, so the fact that Matthew has something similar in the composite discourse should not be paralleled with the Mark 8 passage, because it's the wrong parallel from Matthew. Instead, it looks like Matthew really believed that Jesus taught it twice, and he's trying to convey that, at least twice, trying to convey that to his readers. Rather than snipping it from a different setting in Mark and moving it to the commissioning discourse. This moves us to look at other cases where other Gospels, other than Matthew, show similar sayings on multiple occasions, again, just within a single Gospel. And this is an argument that Jesus taught the same thing more than once, because we find even within single Gospels, his teaching the same thing more than once. Okay, Luke, for example, has this saying about denying oneself, taking up one's cross, losing your life to find it, and being denied before the angels, in that same setting, right when he's telling him he's going to die and so forth, okay? Luke 9:23 through 27. So you could think of this as what's sometimes called triple tradition material. It's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all at that same point. But Luke also, right in Luke, records a very similar saying about confessing versus denying Jesus and being denied before the angels in an achronological place where it's just not clear what the saying is in Luke 12:8. So Luke himself seems to be attesting from whatever his sources are that Jesus taught that one must be prepared to confess Jesus under pressure or risk being disowned before the angels on more than one occasion. You find it twice in Luke. And in fact, Luke even records a third saying in Luke 17:33, where Jesus says that whoever tries to keep his life will lose it. Okay, three very similar sayings, or at least parts of very similar things, in three different recordings in the Gospel of Luke. And we find yet another occasion with a similar saying about losing your life to keep it being recorded in John 12:25. Okay, so which is in Holy Week. Okay, so it's very believable that this was an important theme for Jesus. You must deny yourself. You must take up your cross. If you deny me, I will deny you. If you confess me, I will honor you before the Father and the holy angels, etc. It was just one of his themes. And that he taught various parts of it over and over again. In fact, in 2 Timothy 2:11 through 12, something very much like this: if we deny him, he will deny us. If we suffer, we will also reign with him. Okay, is found incorporated into either an early hymn or an early bit of liturgy, which the author says it is a faithful saying. So the early church was aware that this was a huge theme for Jesus. So you see what Carson means when he says that the Gospels themselves confirm in very clear ways that Jesus taught the same thing on more than one occasion, in ways that do not depend a priori on taking a particular stance on whether Matthew made dyschronological composite discourses, because you find the very same saying sometimes more than once within one gospel. All right, one more. Matthew 10:24 and following. This again is in that commissioning discourse. Jesus said stuff to his disciples before sending them out. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a slave above his master. It is enough for the disciple that he become like his teacher, and the slave like his master. If they have called the head of the house Beelzebul, how much more will they malign the members of his household? All right, commissioning discourse. All right, Luke 6:40, which is the Sermon on the Level Place, which I've argued, if there is a parallel, it's to the Sermon on the Mount, so that would be a different setting, records the saying that a servant is not above his master, a pupil is not above his teacher, but everyone after he has been fully trained will be like his teacher. Very similar, Luke 6:40. So, does that mean that Matthew went and grabbed a saying that he knew was said in a different context, in the Sermon on the Mount context, but maybe, he thought he already had enough material there, and moved it to make up a composite, to kind of bulk out a composite discourse, at the commissioning that Jesus never uttered recognizably in that context. Is that evidence for it? When we parallel Matthew, that passage in Matthew 10 about the servant not being above his master, and the saying in Luke 40 about the student not being above his teacher. No, it's not. We find Jesus teaching the very same thing twice in another gospel, John. And more, in John we find him teaching it twice just on the night in which he was betrayed. That a servant is not greater than his master, John 13:16 and John 15:20. One of those is apropos of washing each other's feet so that they should follow his example. The other is apropos of being persecuted. So while these are neither of them the setting found in Luke or Matthew, neither of the settings found in Luke or Matthew, because neither of those is the night of the Last Supper, John is independently confirming that Jesus was very fond of this teaching. He's saying it twice on the same night in John. And in fact, Jesus actually says, I have told you before. It's in I said to you. That's in John 15:20, the second one. Now that might be referring to his saying something similar earlier on that same night. That's plausible, but the context, he's slightly shifting that context of that proverbial saying and saying it apropos of persecution in John 15:20. It actually fits better with the Matthew 10:24, which I just read to you about persecution. So actually it's possible that Jesus is alluding in John 15:20 all the way back to his saying that to them in the commissioning discourse, because it fits even better than the same saying on the same night. But the point is that we can tell Jesus was fond of this, and John independently confirms that by telling that Jesus said something similar on the very same night. All right, so there's no reason from the different settings of a somewhat similar saying in Matthew and Luke to say, Matthew went and cut and pasted it and moved it to his commissioning discourse dyschronologically to make a composite discourse. All right, I hope it's clear how that argument goes. And this was just very powerful to me when I was studying this for my the appendix that I wrote in the Mirror or the Mask on the allegation of composite discourses in Matthew, to realize that on a number of occasions, you actually find these sayings being taught twice or even more than twice within the same gospel, which is just direct confirmation that Jesus repeated himself, and that therefore we shouldn't all be out here eye-rolling that at the theory that Jesus repeated himself, like, oh, brother. What a fundamentalist you would have to be to think that. Now, the next time, I will be talking about a few more places where it really appears that Jesus taught the same thing on more than one occasion, even though it's not taught twice in a single gospel. But this should have set up that to tell us that that's okay. As a theory, that's not something we should be ashamed of. So I hope this is helpful for spine stiffening. If someone says everybody knows that the gospel authors engaged in dyschronological narration, just look at the Sermon on the Mount or the commissioning discourse in Matthew, voila. It's by no means that clear. So please come back next time to the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.